Hello, this is Dr. Churchill, and this is Astronomy 308, Into the Final Frontier. And today is lecture 1.1a, and I'm calling it The Wanderers. Excuse me. And I think what I really want you to pull away from today's lecture is the fact that there's some force that exists in life for it to expand into its environment and diversify and adapt. And that humans are part of that process. And what we've done since the inception or the growth of our species is to continue to expand on the globe. And so today is a brief review, excuse me, of that expansion onto the globe, which has set the stage for our expansion into the solar system. And I'd like to say that you'll be watching a few videos. I'll put links below here on YouTube, but they're also on the module on Canvas. One is the same voiceover, but two different videos. It's called The Wanderers, and it's Carl Sagan. And I have The Wanderers one, which kind of goes back and shows more of the nomadic wandering and interspersed with space wanderings that are projected for the future. The second one is where it's mostly just visuals of the projection of the future, showing the possibilities of what humans might be doing in the solar system. Interestingly, it shows only sort of the entertainment value, or if you will, sports value of humans out in space, and not necessarily the commercialization of space, which is probably a more realistic visual of what will happen. Nonetheless, sandwiched between those two videos is a video called The History of the World Every Year. It's about just under 20 minutes long, and it goes by very, very fast. So today's lecture, what I'm going to do is sort of hit a couple freeze frames from that movie of how humans explored and expanded into the world. And also you'll find that for module one, or I should say part one of the class, the quote, the sea race, there's going to be some key years that I pull out for us to look at for that. So anyhow, I'd like to go ahead and move on with the lecture. So I'm going to share my screen for the lecture notes. Okay, hopefully you can see that just fine. And so this is the opening slide, wandering, exploring, and expanding. And it's basically trying to emphasize this idea that we are going to step out into space is the next thing. And so I have a quote here at the bottom from Carl Sagan, you know, we began as wanderers and we are wanderers still. And it's true. Until we become extinct, we will remain wanderers. So on the left, you know, we began as nomads of the planet, and that's what really today's lecture is about. And then the idea for the rest of the class is, you know, will we continue as nomads of the galaxy? You know, will we continue to expand in this way? So I want to go to the next slide and say, you know, on the left here, you can see a nomadic people. I wouldn't say they're exploring, but they might, for practical reasons, be expanding out into new environments, okay? And so Carl Sagan has romanticized this idea. If you don't know who Carl Sagan is, he was a famous astronomer, passed away in 1996. He wrote a book called Cosmos, put together a movie series called Cosmos, and in general has done really amazing science and popularization of science. And his quote here is, you know, your own life, your bands, or even your species might be owed to the restless few, meaning not everybody has this spirit, but some do. Drawn by a craving they can hardly articulate or understand, to basically go out to undiscovered lands and new worlds. And so this is an interesting statement because it's talking about the fact that this is ingrained in our species, but it's not ingrained in everybody. And the thing about it is that because of those few, we really owe the success of the human race to these few. We'll be talking about some of these people throughout the class. Then he also has this other great quote, and this is in the movie, The Wanderers. These are quotes from that movie. "We are bounded only by the earth and the ocean and the sky. The open road still softly calls." As I say, it's a romanticization of the idea of exploring. And so I have showing here, the idea of exploring the lands, exploring the world by a ship, which was done, is through the ship that and the oceans that we really came to know our planet in full, and then by the air. And so the invention of humans making it into the air. Each of these is, in a sense, what we call a breakthrough technology. You have to have an idea of horses or camels as a way of transporting goods and using that technology. Then you get a little more sophisticated and you can build things like ships. You can harness power like winds. Then eventually you can harness power like fossil fuels in the combustion engine and understand enough physics to apply the Bernoulli principle. I believe that's the principle by which lift underneath the wing is applied. And of course, the open road still softly calls. And of course, the reference to that is the open road now is out into space, because we basically found every road almost on the earth. Of course, we could still explore the oceans or whatnot for scientific reasons. It's not clear whether we will go under the ocean as a means of expanding where we actually live and work. I would imagine that we will at some point in time, that will require breakthrough technologies. But a breakthrough technology that happened in the 20th century, of course, was the rocket, which we'll be talking about in a great deal. And I kind of enjoyed this picture because, here is an open road that led to the rocket, which then is taking off into the new ocean, if you will, of space. And so this is where we are today. We've gone through all of these three steps and we're here today. And it's amazing to think of where we might be in the future with other breakthrough technologies. Before we get started on our little tour of the history, I just want to say that it's really good to take a meta view of humanity into full perspective. And a meta view means basically standing above and looking at the whole thing holistically, sort of an overview effect, if you will. And in fact, the next lecture is on the overview effect, which we'll describe more. But this is, in a sense, talking about ourselves as a natural living mammal, a natural living being on the planet. And so I've written here that all life tends to increase its odds of reproductive success by diversifying, and therefore you hedge against extinction that way. And one of the ways that is to expand into these different available ecological niches. And in each niche, the environment's a little bit different, and with time, then you evolve adaptations to these environments. Okay, so are we humans really any different than that? Well, if you are a follower of science and the Darwin evolutionary idea of it's called uneven reproductive success, is basically the conclusion of Darwin, that not all members of the species are as successful at reproduction, and therefore with time, certain traits are carried forward in the species and other traits are lost. And over time, this can actually result in great changes in the physical appearance or the ability, intelligence of the species. We expand, okay? So the question I'm sort of putting here is it encoded in our DNA? Is it sort of a DNA thing about life on Earth, or is it some kind of central component to a life force of all living matter? I mean, even if life as we know it on another planet, it could be a completely different type of life. Would it also have this life force, if you will, to want to expand? Or is it unique to the human condition? I would argue it's not, okay? I would argue that it's something about the life force. Like, it could be the DNA, but one of the first two questions, I believe, is more in the affirmative. The thing that's changed over time and makes humans different than what I'll call the animal kingdom is that we've become self-aware of our expansion. Okay, we can collectively, the fact that we're having this discussion, conceive of the whole of our expansion, and we can understand its impact on the environment and understand that new resources are available when we actually can rationalize those thoughts. That may not have always been the case in the very, very early days, say, 30,000 plus years ago. We may not have really been self-aware of the idea of this collective expansion, okay? But now we're definitely aware of that. And that is sort of an evolutionary change in understanding ourselves, okay? So what I'd like to do here is take a brief tour of how the world came to be and how we made it by our drive to expand. And then I want you to keep in mind, that's everything in this class, keep in mind, where are we going? Where are we going to take it from here? I mean, this is a huge story that led us to today. And today we are writing what the future is going to be. We are at the bleeding edge, the cutting edge of this story of humanity. Okay, so let's move to that. So I'm just going to show a few snapshots from the movie The History of the World every year and pick out a couple major, if you will, key years. Okay, so this is a map at 43,000 before the Common Era, BCE, before the Common Era, which 0 would be the transference to then the Common Era. So, okay, so we basically came out of Africa, and it looks like we have some embryonic ideas of groups of people building civilizations, but it's not really civilization as we know. We came out of Africa, and literally in a very short period of time, we populated almost every continent on the planet, okay? And so when we jump ahead here to about 2500 BC, we start to see the actual first civilization. So you can see we've populated the planet except for Greenland and Iceland and some Arctic islands, maybe Madagascar, New Zealand and whatnot. But the fact of the matter is we've started to see regional areas that we can discuss, and we see the first beginnings of civilization here. And this area here that I'm marking with my mouse is called the Fertile Crescent. And we shouldn't forget Minoa, which was a very advanced civilization in the Mediterranean as well. It was along these two rivers, and we had some settlements here, we had agriculture developing, but the point of the matter is sometime around 2500 BC, we have the first settling down and the first civilizations. If we jump ahead now to about 2000 BCE, we see the first unified kingdoms happening where people have actually taken a whole area and unified it under a single political and sort of economic system, kept control of it through military establishment and things like that. And of course, Egypt was one of the very first ever kingdoms. And then we have the Assyrian kingdom, which was quite a big deal. And in China, we start to see a kingdom developing over here. So this is somewhere around 2000 BCE. And then when we get to about 330 BCE approximately, we see that Greece has really become a very strong civilization, strong military as well. Maybe you've heard of the Age of Pericles. That's when Athens was a democracy, for a government that was a democracy. And you had Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all of these people. And then, of course, Alexander and his army took over. And we have the the first great conquering of a region. And this turns out to be a theme that continues to happen. And of course, I'm bringing this up. Why? Because are we going to continue to do this when we go out into the solar system? Are we going to have wars and try to conquer and planets for different groups of people that are the haves, and still continue to have this dichotomy of the haves and the have-nots, the controllers and the controlled? So if we jump ahead now to 100 CE, which is, I guess you would say, the time that the Roman Empire has expanded to its maximum. And so in Europe here, we see the development of the Roman Empire, and it had to fight very hard to gather all of this land. And of course, this is only 400 years after Alexander's empire. So it's not a whole lot of time, but you can see that they've gone up into England and gone around this entire area. Meanwhile, we have some unification happening here in the Iranian area. And then we have the Han Dynasty in China developing. So we start to see these large kingdoms building up. It looks like I can't spell height. Sorry about that. Okay, if we move now to about 700 CE, this is actually just before the Viking Era, which was from 800 to 1100 CE. And you can see that the Roman Empire has been broken up. And what we'll talk about a little bit later is that it was preserved in the east over here as the Byzantine Empire. And this is the area that preserved basically Western culture as we know it. And we had this ununified area here, small kingdoms and whatnot. Now, the Arabic world really expanded during this time. And you'll see actually that they came up into the Iberian Peninsula of modern day Spain and had moved their way all the way halfway or so into France. And there was a desperate battle by the Europeans of the time, the French people of the time, to fend them off. There was a huge battle here. And had the Arabs won that, the outcome of the world may have been very different. But in the end, the French won that battle and they pushed the Arabs back into Spain. And then, of course, eventually they pushed them out of Spain. And interestingly, you have Spain as this crossroads of the Arabic and European world, very much in the way that the Byzantine Empire, which became Turkey, was a cross between the Arabic and the Eastern European world. So this is an interesting time here where the Arabs really had expanded. And a little bit later, they even go into Eastern China. So they really expanded at this time. Now, if we jump ahead to about 1017, we are in the midst of the Viking Era, and we're going to spend some time talking about the Viking Era in the near future as well. So they came out of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and the Swedes really came over here into this eastern area and became the seeds of what will become the Russians in the future. And then you have them, they've taken over a great deal of England, a place that we call Danelaw, and they've expanded into the islands. They expanded into Iceland, they expanded into Greenland, and they actually set up some settlements in the areas of the North America. And so at the height of their expansion, they had actually discovered, quote unquote, the New World. And you'll see that some proto-civilizations are beginning to set into motion here in the Americas. Now, more could have happened in the Americas that we know, but all the history of the Americas really got pretty much wiped out. So we don't really know as much information. And so that's why this area is not detailed. We really don't know a lot of what happened here. Now, I'm not a historian, so there might be some people who could tell you a lot more about how much was lost and what we know and don't know. Okay, now if we jump all the way to 1246, we find this gigantic empire called the Mongolian Empire. And this is the period of time when Marco Polo did all of his explorations and things like that. And we're going to talk about the Mongolian Empire because its expansion really set the stage for the European exploration of the globe. Okay. Now, if you go back here, you'll see that there's this area here controlled by the Arabs, and it was like a great curtain, like a wall of which no Europeans could really pass, even though there was this border shared with the European Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire at the time. There was a lot of great tension here, but the Mongolians came along and basically wiped all of this wall out. And so you have an opening now. And what happened is that the Western people went east and the Eastern people went west. And so you had this time where for about 100 years, 150 years, you could have this open trade going, and people learned about this Eastern world and brought it back to Europe. And that was highly transformative. Okay. You'll notice here that the Vikings are still out here in Greenland and Iceland, but have retracted from the Americas at this point in time. Okay. So that's basically the thing I wanted to talk about at this period is this huge Mongolian Empire. It was the largest land empire ever. And then you see the Holy Roman Empire has built itself up here. And France, and then you can see that the Arabs have been pushed out of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, if we move ahead to 1488, this is a very, very special period. In fact, year 1488. Okay, so after the Mongolian Empire fell, that great curtain got set up again, and the east-west trade routes were completely shut down. And so what happened is that the Europeans decided maybe we can sail around Africa to get there. And the Europeans that thought of that first were the Portuguese. And so this fellow named Bartholomew Diaz was commissioned to sail, and in 1488, he made it around the tip of Africa. And his crew forced him to turn back. He came back. But in 1488, it was discovered for the first time that you can get around the south of Africa. And therefore, shortly after that, the Portuguese continued to sail. They came to India and they conquered all of the ports in this area, disrupted all of the culture and trade, were basically pirates, and started a slave trade. And things changed dramatically for the world after 1488. You'll also notice this in 1492, 4 years later, is when Columbus will sail to the Americas, and then we'll see that the Spanish take over and the French and the English take over the Americas. Right now, in 1488, this is the last golden age of the civilizations that were beginning to flourish and were actually well established in the Americas. Okay, so you have the Aztecs, the Mayans, and you have the Inca Empire, as well as I think they're called the Tarascans as well. So there was some tension amongst these empires, of course, but they were very sophisticated cities and city-states at the time. Okay, they are going to, this is their last hurrah, actually. Now, if we move to 1541, so we've jumped up only about 50 years here. By 1521, Magellan had circumnavigated the globe. And so the Europeans had understood now the extent of the planet and the fact that they had a continent between them. And the Spanish, they took a different approach. Instead of being basically raiders and taking over ports and controlling the area this way, they actually destroyed the empires that were there and basically colonized the entire area and took it as their own lands. And so you can see that the southern empires here, the Mayans and the Aztec and the Incas, by this time they were completely wiped out by the armies of Spain. And you can see that Portugal has taken an interest in this area. Now we're going to find out, well, why did the Portuguese get this area and why did the Spanish get this area? And we'll talk about that in 1497, there was a treaty which basically split the world in two. The Spanish get this half and the Portuguese get that half. Kind of a crazy idea, but it stopped wars from happening at the time. And we'll talk about that. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And as we, the other thing I want to talk about here is this Ottoman Empire. And this Ottoman Empire was very powerful, and it really came into being around the late 1300s, early 1400s. You can see that this is an Arabic empire, and this empire is going to last all the way into World War I, and then be destroyed in World War I. Okay, so this was quite a force of the world for quite a while. And what's interesting, though, is that we'll talk about this. The Arabs never got in their ships and decided to sail to the New World. And, that's a major question as to why the world has the power balance that it has today. Why did not the Ottoman Empire or the early empires, why didn't they sail forth in the same way that the Western powers did? We see set up over here in the East, the Ming Dynasty, China being unified. One of the things we'll talk about is that China also had great fleets that sailed through this entire area and maybe even around the tip of Africa. By 1540, of course, those were all stopped. So there was a brief period that was actually before the Portuguese came around the Horn, that the Chinese had spread out here. The difference was the Chinese did not become pirates. They did not become colonizers. They distributed their glory of their central empire, their kingdom, and they took what's called, oh gosh, I forget what it's called now, but they set up a system where people would pay them money as a tribute. That's what it's called, a tributary system. They would receive gifts from other peoples as tribute and recognition that they were great, but they never went in and raided these people or enslaved them or anything like that, like the West did. Okay, moving to 1710. This is an era that is sort of pre-revolution in America. Over here in the Americas, we have the British, which are pink, setting up the colonies as we know them, expanding down into the South, having control of the Hudson Bay. They are at odds with France, who has expanded up into this area here. The United States will eventually purchase this from France. The Spanish have expanded their kingdom all the way up. They eventually will come up further into the California area. And the Portuguese have expanded into the area of Brazil. One thing that's not really reflected on here is that the Dutch are going to become a world power as well. We'll talk about that. They really changed the world. We'll talk about that. Notice that Russia is now expanding. This is a remnant of the leftover conquering, if you will, or I should say mixing of the Vikings during the Viking Age. Okay, now we're in 1860. You may have noticed the Ottoman Empire is still sticking around. It's one of those very long-lasting empires. 1860, so now we're at the year before the Civil War in the United States started, and you can see that England is really starting to grow in their global influence, okay? And you'll see that we're just starting to Europe is getting its eyes on Africa and starting to carve it up into colonies. And of course, we have Spain all the way down here in South America through Mexico. We have Brazil having grown out much more now. And then England having Canada. And then we have the Russian Empire, including what's Alaska. And then British India, British New Zealand, and British Australia. And we're going to find out that, before World War I, Britain really was, they said the sun never set on the British Empire. So this is an area of imperialism that came out of the sea race. Okay, 1914, the year before World War I started, which really changed the map. And you'll notice in Europe, you really have the Austrian Empire with the Habsburgs. You have the German Empire, if you will, with its colonies, and the Kaiser, the country of France and Spain and England. England having a huge empire all across the world. And Germany and Austria, they wanted a piece of that. And then you can see the Ottoman Empire has been shrinking, and there's a British interest now in Africa that's pushing in this direction. And this really is the beginnings of the crisis that we've been having for decades now in the Middle East, is this confrontation. So anyway, there's some alignment here between Germany and Austria. They fought the West and they fought the Russians. The Russians were actually allies with the British and the French until 1917. Then they capitulated with their revolution, the Communist Revolution, and they pulled out of the war. And then you see the Republic of China here. They are also undergoing civil war. There's a battle for communism to take over there as well. So the United States is pretty well formed by 1914. And it was 1912 that New Mexico became a state. So things are still changing. And then we come to the year 2000, which is about the time that most of you were born or shortly before you were born. And we can see that Africa has been split up here into various sectors, if you will. And of course, these countries have one by one been obtaining their independence. Iran has formed itself quite large. Here's Iraq, and here is Afghanistan. India has became independent, split with Pakistan, the Muslim component, and India stayed the Hindu component. And then you have Bangladesh here, separated out. It used to be East Pakistan. Australia has become independent. And then you can see that even though this is the same color almost as England, these are all independent countries now. And you can see that the independent countries that have developed in South America as well. But you can tell that the religions, the language, everything that is spread about in the world is a result of that sea race and that exploration that happened. I'd like to mention here that China finished its civil war in 1949. The communists were able to take over. That was shortly after World War II. We are up to a population that is getting very close to 8 billion people. And we have a doubling time, I think, for the planet on the order of about 39 years right now. So that means if we continue to grow, we'll have 18 billion people on the planet. Now, we are at the edge of sustainability for our planet. And so it would seem that we would have to listen to the beckoning of the open road and expand out into the solar system. So I want to go back to the romanticism here for just a moment and remind you of those quotes of the wanderers that, there may be only a few people in the species that really are exploring and exploiting the world. But our survivability on the planet, our survival as a species is really related to that. So that's the first quotes that we were talking about. Does our open road still softly call? And so Carl Sagan, whom I've got a picture of here now, he said, maybe it's too early. Maybe the time's not quite yet. Now remember, he said that back in the 90s or back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but we're now in the 2020s. So maybe the time is now. But, he says, those other worlds promising untold opportunities beckon us. Silently, they are orbiting the sun and they are waiting. So all of that is out there, and we just have to have the will and the drive and the breakthrough technology to go there. Okay. And he ends with, exploration is in our nature. We began as wanderers. We still are wanderers. We have lingered long enough on the shores of our cosmic ocean. We are ready at last to set sail for the stars. And so as I powered through that discussion of world history, I want you to think about every year, every day that happened where people were pushing forth new boundaries and trying to expand humanity. We're going to talk a lot about the good and the bad of everything that happened there, because we need to know and think about the good and the bad, because as we move out into the solar system, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to just try to take as much good and learn from history and not take the bad? Or are we going to ignore the history and take the good and the bad as we move out into the solar system? Now, there's some great quotes that I don't have here from Elon Musk, and who says basically, we have to get off our dust ball if we're going to survive. Stephen Hawking says the same thing. If we are going to survive as a species, we have to get off the earth. And I believe that one of the great quotes that I have for the class here is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who just before World War I said, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever." And so the question is, will we go? How will we go? And when will we go? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Okay, so I'm back, and I just want to say that I hope that you will watch those videos. And I'm not asking you to memorize all this history. I'm asking you to allow yourself to experience and be exposed to it and to absorb it. Just the idea of this story of humanity, this struggle, and this great expansion. And to remember that we can take a meta view of this. In fact, we have romanticized exploration. And Carl Sagan has clearly romanticized the idea of exploration. I would like to say that maybe we should really just romanticize the idea of what we can do and where we can go and what we can become, what our potentialities are with exploration. So I'd like you to watch the first video, and then, you know, the world history one, it really goes by fast. You can't absorb it all, but just watch it. It's very fascinating. And then watch the Wanderers again, having thought about all of that wandering that we did and where we're going. And what I really wanted to ask you is, when you do watch the videos, even these lectures, that you are able to isolate yourself and allow yourself to feel what's being conveyed to you and experience it, rather than sort of being distracted, because there's some powerful messages, there's some powerful feelings that can be evoked if you allow yourself to be, you know, sucked into, if you will, the whole, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble articulating, but allow yourself to be sucked into the message that's being taught and talked about. Okay, so when we come back for the next lecture, I will be talking about the overview effect. And the overview effect is, again, another meta experience, because what I'm going to talk about in this class is there always has to be this expansion of technology, but there has to be this expansion of the mind. The mind has to understand it can go somewhere, the human mind, before it can think about how to go there, okay? And so that is a very important part of it, is the realizations that we have. Okay, so we'll see you next time, and enjoy the videos. Take care.